Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece for a Reason to Resist on June 25th, 2026. We are pleased to be joined again by our good friend John Helmer, the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau independent of national or commercial ties. John, you've been prolifically writing in recent days. There's a lot of ground I'd like to cover with you. And I thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. Good to be back.
So before we begin, folks, please remember to like and share this video if you find it to be informative. And if you're not already a subscriber, please become one and help us to expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism. So John, on Monday of this week, June 22nd, Ukrainian forces, or at least we're led to believe it was Ukrainian forces, struck the Voronezh semiconductor plant, which reportedly produces electronics for Russia's Iskander and Kh-101 missiles. These are important elements of the Russian arsenal, as well as the Pantsir S-1 air defense system, which is an important element of Russia's air defense network. And here is a video of the apparent aftermath of that strike. Now, later on that day, the Voronezh Oblast governor, Alexander Gusev, reported that 5 people had been killed and dozens injured in the attack. His oblast, Voronezh, directly borders eastern Ukraine, with the regional capital located about 200 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-held territory in Kharkiv Oblast. John, for months, it seems Ukrainian forces have become increasingly effective at striking important targets inside Russia. What do you make of this strike, and how do you think the Russian military will be directed by the president to respond?
The strikes have been described as largely pinprick for years and months now. They also have a significant public relations promotional effect. The columns of black smoke coming out of the St. Petersburg refinery, the Moscow refinery, the Voronezh attacks that you've just described, and many others, are more than now PR. They're more than an attempt, which is the way it's been interpreted in the Russian press, by an increasingly desperate, I'm quoting you from my Russian sources and also the Russian mainstream press, increasingly desperate Ukrainian regime and military command facing losses at Konstantinovka and all other major front offensive positions in the Donbass. Facing that, they've escalated their drone attacks, moving from refineries, as you've pointed out and we've discussed before, to military industrial complex targets inside Russia. The fact that they're capable of escalating drone attack is an indication that the Russian General Staff's attacks on the Ukrainian military industrial complex, in particular the drone manufacturing complex, is not achieving its strategic objective, its operational objective. Operationally, the Ukrainian drone attacks have increased in volume and increased in spread and precision of targeting. That requires US, European, NATO help in all sorts of ways, satellite intelligence and other forms of surveillance, plus an integration with the Ukrainian targeting of CIA and other forms of intelligence on the locations of Russian military industrial plants. So what we have is much more now than a demonstration that Ukraine can continue the war. It's an attempt by the Europeans and the United States to demonstrate that the war against Russia is succeeding or that, short of success, it's capable of continuing to impose very high levels of damage, visibly high levels, put it that way, damage on the Russian side during an election campaign. So part of the purpose is to demonstrate Russian vulnerability to Russian voters. Part of the purpose is to demonstrate to the NATO alliance and to members of Congress in Washington and everyone else pitching in for the war against Russia that this war can be won. All they have to do is stick with it. That's clearly the strategy. And President Putin has, in the last few days, indicated that part he understands. But he's just admitted in a speech and in interaction with military academy graduates on the 23rd of this week.
Can I just intervene there for a moment, John? Because that was the next thing I was going to ask you about, as a matter of fact. And I wanted to draw our audience's attention to a particular excerpt from the speech. I believe that this was commentary offered by the president in response to a question from a colonel.
Yes.
And so here's what he reportedly said. The remark that was directed at the president: NATO countries have allowed for launching drones from their territory to our facilities. Do they even realize the consequences? And President Putin said, apparently not, though there is growing unease within their societies and those forces that do not want confrontation, that publicly call for building relations with our country, are gaining ground. Look at what is happening in Germany. All the political forces that advocate aggression against Russia, that push for escalation and armed conflict, their ratings are plummeting. Every party that champions that path has seen its support steadily decline. And then bolded in the last paragraph, he said, they have not yet gone so far as to launch anything from their own territory. They understand that would invite a retaliatory strike. I think everyone realizes that, or ought to. And so they are doing everything they can to keep their distance. When Ukrainian drones go astray in the Baltic states, for example, they do not point the finger at Moscow. They admit they are Ukrainian and so forth. So I read this, and I'm really interested to hear what your reaction to this and other aspects of his speech to the military academy. But I read this as an implicit assurance to, I guess, the world that Russia will only retaliate if there is a launch from the territory of a NATO state, and
Yes.
that even if the NATO state allows its airspace to be used for drones and missiles launched from Ukraine, the Russian military would not retaliate against that NATO state. And so that seems to me to be effectively a green light for them to do just that, to allow their airspace to be used for projectiles launched from Ukraine. In any case, how do you read this excerpt and the speech generally?
I think you've read it correctly, Dimitri. It's a green light flashed by the president in the wrong direction. There are 2 or 3 fundamental misconceptions here on the president's part, and to see them so boldly stated is very unusual. Let me just go through the 2 big ones. In the first place, the president does, in response to the colonel asking him the question, he says, and I'll just repeat it, look at what is happening in Germany. All the political forces advocating aggression against Russia, their ratings are plummeting. This is a fundamental misreading of the politics in Germany. It's a fundamental misreading of the politics in France. It's a fundamental misreading of the politics in the UK. You'll see not only President Putin saying this stuff, you'll see that Kirill Dmitriev, his special representative for the United States, has been banging away on a misreading of British politics in the belief that the US has helping Russia bring the Europeans under control in order to reach a better peaceable arrangement between Trump and Putin and between Russia and the Europeans. This is wrong. It's not. It's not how can I put it to you? The understanding of what's going on in Germany misreads the future. The actual rise of the ADF, the Alternative for Germany Party, is certainly to be noticed. It can't be mistaken. It's up between 25 and 30%. There is an increase in Die Linke, the left, to about 10%. There's an increase in Sarah Wagenknecht group between 3 and 5%, but only Wagenknecht at about 5% is committed to the kind of revision of German-Russian relations. The ADF is simply unreliable. The same story you can say, and we should be saying, about Mr. Bardella and the Rassemblement National in France. Yes, their ratings are going up, but they're not capturing French cities, and they are not looking capable of winning the presidency in 2027 in a second round. And in order, they think, Rassemblement National, RN, currently headed by Bardella, but behind him, Marine Le Pen, will do almost anything to head into the French center to recapture French votes. That means that they will minimize their view about the, let's call it, revision of France's relations with Russia. As for what's happened in the UK, nobody could have been more fundamentally mistaken than Putin's whisperer, Dimitri, on what's just happened in the UK. Yes, Starmer's been forced out. He's been told good riddance by the President of the United States. That's an interesting intervention in British politics. It turns them into a US colony, but never mind that. Most British voters want to see the back of Starmer. Most Russians do too. Dmitriev and Putin too. But he's been replaced by Andrew Burnham. And nobody in Russian-British relations could be as hostile to Russia, intent on increasing British defense budget in order to arm against Russia. Nobody could be more committed to the war against Iran and Gaza and the Arabs than Burnham. There's no achievement there. If Putin thinks that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party in Britain will either win power or significantly influence, as a minority party, a powerful one, a change in British views, he's not only mistaken on the facts. What President Putin is beginning to show absolutely clearly, he doesn't understand imperialism. He really doesn't. In fact, if I might refer to the part of his speech to the military academy graduates, before he had the informal conversation with the cadets, the graduates, and the colonel, this is what he said. He said, and this is in a way correct, but wait for the last line. President Putin is saying, the action plan of the pseudo-democratic West is very simple. First, they create threats for our country, forcing us to take action necessary for defending and protecting our country. Then they immediately accuse us of all mortal sins to justify their continued aggressive policy and their aggressive actions against Russia. That's correct. No doubt about it. He's got that right. But wait for this. We know this very well, he says. Even after the treacherous attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, and it was a treacherous attack, the West and Hitler's Germany tried to accuse the Soviet Union and Stalin of aggression against what we currently know as the collective West. Last line, it's surprising, says President Putin, that certain quasi-scientific quarters continue to seriously consider this. Now, what's surprising, and to whom? To whom is this surprising? This man was brought up during the Soviet period and was fully educated in Marxist method, imperialist foreign policy, that's the other side. Has he totally forgotten? Is it surprising to him that the West, meaning the United States as well as Europe, are rearming against Russia. When didn't they? When
Right.
did the US empire cease to plot the downfall of Russia? It's simply taken different phases. Yes, but what President Putin has just gone and admitted, on the one hand, is one reading of the reason for rearmament correct. He's correcting the propaganda picture, but he shows he fails to understand the enemy. He fails to understand the strategy. He fails fundamentally to understand that the US and Europe are together to destroy Russia, just as they're together to destroy Iran and to destroy Gaza and the Arab resistance in the Middle East. Now, that's an admission. It's never, in my opinion, been so clear that Putin does not understand imperialism. He does not understand and wishes to wish it away. And wish it away by misrepresenting the facts in Germany, the facts in France, the facts in the UK, the facts in Italy, and on we go. So that's the structure we have now, as you began, Dimitri, and thanks for pointing it out. The Voronezh attack is an escalation from the empire side, the United States, the Europeans, and on the Ukrainians on the battlefield. Okay, if President Putin wants to say we will retaliate against NATO if they dare to fire from their territory, he is no longer credible. Not because it won't happen. Yes, it will not happen. Let's say the Imperial Alliance against Russia is absolutely confident he will not strike a NATO territory. Correct. And until now, the reason for that was he insists on believing the United States is against Europe in this plan for the future of Russia's demise. Well, the point is rather different if you looked at it operationally. If he wants to deter NATO, and he wants to strike back at the escalation against the refineries, and they're doing serious damage to the flow of petrol, essence, benzene, different names, different places, during the summer driving season in Russia. If he wants to deter the new attacks on the military-industrial complex of Russia, why doesn't he attack the delivery points between Poland and the Ukraine, where the drone components, the drone elements, and the drones themselves, and all the other NATO supplies come in? It's not simply that President Putin makes a threat to attack NATO if NATO attacks Russia. He is allowing the entire logistics flow from NATO onto the Ukraine battlefield to exist. And that makes no operational sense at all if you take what he says at the beginning to be his view.
On this subject of these right-wing populist parties, being opposed to the Ukraine war, I vaguely recall, John, that when Giorgia Meloni rose to power in Italy, there was considerable speculation about whether she was going to oppose the European support for the proxy war in Russia. And she turned out to be as dutiful a servant of Washington as anybody in Europe. And in fact, Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, just disclosed, this is just how dutiful a servant she is of Washington, that she allowed Italian soil to be used for 500 sorties against Iran during the criminal war of aggression, and thereby making her own country a target, which I think is within the range of some Iranian missiles. So this is how abject a vassal she turned out to be. And I completely concur with you. The idea that any of these people, with the possible exception of Sarah Wagenknecht, is going to actually seek true and lasting peace with Russia is laughable, if they were ever to assume power. And I'm not sure that any of them ever will. But when it comes to the real posture of Washington at this point in time towards Russia, I want to share with you and our audience Is there anything you want to say on that subject on Meloni, or should we move on?
Well, look, I have friends who can keep me briefed on Italian politics. First of all, can we simply drop the label right or extreme right when referring to either Meloni or the Reform Party in the UK, or the RN in Paris, or the ADF in AFD in Germany? It doesn't help to use this so-called far right labels. The fact is that governance in each of these countries is becoming neo-fascist. It's based on these fundamental doctrines that were considered fascist, were part of Hitler's doctrines during the 30s. It doesn't help to call them right, especially since there's no left. And,
I shouldn't laugh. That's a tragedy from my perspective, but you think you nailed it.
It's a problem to be solved for all of us and our audience. It's a problem to be solved. So let's not get into too much of the detail, whether we're talking about Wagenknecht in Germany, or the KKE in Greece, or the left in Italy, or there's nothing left of the left in Britain at all, nothing left at all. But never mind that. If we could drop the labels, then what we're facing is the rearmament of Europe. That's a restructuring of the economic base of each of the European states, which is justified, Putin got that right, by the theory of the Russian threat to Europe. It's a restructuring of the base, and it remains to be seen whether any of these so-called, well, in inverted commas, right parties, which are rising, would represent any significant challenge to that reconstruction of the capital base of these states. What they're representing is, in fact, the domestic pains of each of these economies. So they're also aimed at the problem of immigration, the problem of race hatred, and the problem of crime and race conflict in each of these countries. And that's dominant in France, it's dominant in Germany, it's dominant in the UK. And it's entirely different from warfare and from the diversion of the state budgets away from social welfare, education, healthcare, all of the same things that are happening in the United States too, aimed at reconstructing a base, changing the voter pattern, but based entirely on empire building, an empire expansion, an empire war, permanent war. And unfortunately, on the Russian side, the leadership doesn't get it.
Right. Now, the day before President Putin spoke to those military academy graduates on Tuesday of this week, there was an interesting article in the Kiev Independent. The article was entitled, "Exclusive: Ukraine believes it secured Trump's backing to act more boldly toward Russia." And the article went on to say that Ukraine now believes it has secured White House backing for a campaign aimed at forcing Russia into meaningful negotiations. The Kiev Independent has learned U.S. President Donald Trump privately told Zelensky to act, quote, more boldly, close quote, a senior Ukrainian official told the Kiev Independent. The message comes as Kiev intensifies efforts to secure a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Trump says he doesn't really believe Putin will do anything without pressure, close quote, the official briefed on the recent Trump-Zelensky meeting added. Now, I don't attach a lot of weight to outlets like the Kiev Independent, particularly when they're based on a single unnamed source of the Ukrainian government. But I find this to be entirely consistent with Trump's behavior. Yes. If I just before you comment, I want to add one other thing to this question. So at the same time yesterday, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated that senior U.S. officials, including Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, the shysters of our time, are working to secure a peace agreement in Ukraine. So, John, authorizing Zelensky to be more bold in attacking Russia seems like a rather odd way to pursue peace with Russia. What's your take on all of this?
It's entirely consistent with the behavior of Kushner and Witkoff in Gaza and in Iran. They're deception agents. Their entire role is that of deception agents.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should mention, for example, that President Trump has just allowed Secretary of Defense / War Hegseth to fire General Donahue, the Supreme Allied Commander, the most senior U.S. military officer. Donahue has just been fired. And this follows the purging of the General George, who headed the United States Army. These were the two military officials who participated in the last rounds of Ukraine, Russia, U.S. Negotiations in Abu Dhabi. In other words, what's happening is that Trump is purging, using Hegseth, any U.S. military expertise opposed to the way in which they're constructing their future relationship with Zelensky regime on the one hand and with the European and NATO regimes on the other. I entirely agree. We don't actually count on the Kiev Independent as a reliable source of anything. However, it's more than feasible. We know that there are U.S. elements encouraging and facilitating and arming and financing and guiding and targeting this quotes boldness on the part of the Ukrainians. Yes, they are. This simply puts the advice out of the deep state CIA elements in Kiev and turns them into a Trump remark. And Trump is capable of nodding his head or swearing or making remarks in these G7 meetings and others that would be interpreted as confirmation of what that underlying operational advice is. So you and I agree, and I'm sure our audience agrees, but here we are trying to expose the reality that the US is fully committed to keeping the pressure on Putin. But worse than that, we know that it was in President Trump's signature. He signed the G7 statement, the joint statement that was the product of their conversations in France, which calls for increasing the economic war against Russia. He signed it. Trump signed it. Now, there's a profound unwillingness on the part of the pro-American faction in Moscow to understand that he said that. So it's bound to happen that the Kiev Independent and the Zelensky promoters in Kiev will simply throw the message back. He did sign it. He does say that. He does mean that. Now, then the question operationally from the Russian side, and for all of us to sit here and watch what happens next is, will Putin welcome Kushner and Witkoff in the Kremlin in the coming days? Now, on the one hand, you've got the general staff, the Russian intelligence services, and the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov saying that no, they shouldn't come. In fact, I've just tweeted Lavrov's ironical statement that if they come, he will lend an ear to what they say. He intends that to be ironical. He said, I'm not speaking sarcastically when he said that. He wasn't. He was speaking ironically. Here's why. It's no news to you. You've done a terrific job, Dimitri, in exposing the deception operations that Witkoff and Kushner perpetrated in the 2 rounds of war against Iran since last year, right? Now, as the on the one hand, the Russian side, Lavrov and the others say, look at their performance. They represent deception. They negotiate so-called terms of peace and ceasefire when, in fact, the policy is to escalate and attack. That's what they do. On the other hand, you have President Putin authorizing 2 of his spokesmen, Yuri Ushakov, the former Russian ambassador to the United States, and his foreign policy advisor, to say they're welcome. They will be welcome in the Kremlin. We wait for them to finish their business. This is what Peskov said a few hours ago. We understand they're busy on other matters, meaning they're busy deceiving the Iranians and covering a range of US plans about which Trump is clearer than they are, okay, to keep up the war against Iran, deprive Iran of any significant sanctions over their assets, and so on and so on. We can come back to that if you want to talk about that later. The point is, Peskov says, we understand they're busy, but we'll welcome them as soon as they're ready. That's the president's line. And he's authorized both Peskov and Ushakov to say it. When confronted with the president's line, Lavrov's in a tight spot. And the others, the intelligence chief, Admiral Kostyakov, doesn't speak in public. Lucky him. And that leaves Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy secretary of the Security Council, to say something, but he won't either. It would be simple. And it's perfectly within Medvedev's mandate and his style of talk to say Witkoff and Kushner are liars. Witkoff and Kushner are fronts for aggression. Witkoff and Kushner show in their Iran performance and in their Gaza performance that they cannot be tolerated in Moscow to say anything. And that is not a statement that's been said by anybody yet. Instead, Sergei Lavrov acted ironically. That's where we are. So our audience can look and wait and watch. If Witkoff and Kushner are received at the Kremlin, that's a sign of precisely what the Kiev Independent indicated to be the reason for Trump to say to Zelensky, you're going to act bolder. It indicates that the US thinks Putin is on the back foot and they intend to push him further until he falls over.
You know, John, I've been involved in dozens and dozens of high-stakes negotiations in my career as a lawyer, as a class actions lawyer, and I can tell you, man, I've never had occasion to do this, but I never had to deal with people like these 2 shysters. If I were told that these individuals were going to represent the counterparty in a negotiation, I would flatly refuse to participate in the negotiation. I mean, of course, everybody engages in posturing and there's some dishonesty in the negotiation, but fundamentally, you have to be confident that the other side is acting in good faith, that they actually do want a deal, and they're not just using the negotiation as a pretext to harm you later. And furthermore, you want to have people on the other side of the table who are reasonably knowledgeable about the subject matter they're negotiating about. And these 2 clowns don't know anything at all about Gaza. They don't know anything about Ukraine or Russia. They don't know anything about Iran. They don't know anything about the politics of this region. They're just there to do precisely what you said, which is to effect a deception operation. The whole world should know this by now. I can't understand why anybody, whether the Iranian government, the Russian government, the Palestinians, why anybody would be willing to negotiate with these people. I guess I have to give the Palestinians a bit of a pass because they're in such a weak position militarily speaking. Okay, that I can get it. They're being forced down the throat. These people are being forced down their throat. I could understand that, but The Russians and the Iranians are not in that position. They are at liberty to say, we refuse to participate in negotiation with these two ignorant shysters, and yet they keep welcoming them back. It just blows my mind, John.
Well, let's put it this way. We don't disagree, Dimitri. But let me unpack something that I think indicates that the shystering they do is strategic. It's US policy. It's the empire's policy. Let me just quote from Trump's tweet of yesterday, where he warns that if Iran tries to impose a toll or any form of charge on the passage of vessels through the Hormuz, I'm quoting Trump, negotiations would end immediately, exclamation. Then he goes on to say, additionally, no money is being given to Iran or released from their money to them by the US. We will be releasing some of their money that's totally controlled by us to our farmers and ranchers for the purchase of corn, wheat, soybeans, and more. I'm reading still. Food is desperately needed in Iran, and we will be purchasing it for them exclusively from the United States. Now, that's what Trump said yesterday in kind of advancing his interpretation of the MOU, which Witkoff and Kushner were important figures in the negotiation that was nominally led by Vice President Vance. Now, when Vice President Vance, now running as the Republican candidate for 2028, has taken over the platform of negotiating the, quotes, peace with Iran, during his briefing in Switzerland as he left the negotiations, he made the point of crediting Jared Kushner's scheme for releasing Iran the first tranche, roughly speaking, $6 billion worth of Iranian oil revenues moved from South Korea, where they were earned, to Qatari institutions and held in Qatar under US control. He claimed Kushner had come up with the scheme of releasing the money only on condition it was spent in the United States, and only on condition that the US controlled how the money would be spent and on what US products it would be spent. Vance gave Kushner the particular credit in that briefing. Now, what is that scheme? It's a bribery scheme. A bribery scheme that would involve the Iranians having to bribe the Emir of Qatar and the Kushner associates to allow their own money to be released under the provisions of the MOU, which doesn't provide for any of this stuff at all. In other words, an expensive intermediation that gives the Qataris and Kushner's associates the right to direct Iranian money into US pockets. Yes, Vance thought that was a brilliant scheme, and so does so does Trump. It is a clever scheme. That's what Kushner did, according to Vance. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean? It means a complete violation of the spirit and even the letter of the Iranian MOU. Now, why have I unpacked that? Because there's a comparable scheme underway, promoted for President Putin's authority by Kirill Dmitriev. What has Dmitriev been promoting? A scheme for taking Russia's central bank reserves, frozen, 300 billion, roughly speaking, of dollars and euros, putting it into a US Russia co-development and co-investment fund, and direct some of that money into the Ukraine as, quotes, repairs and reparations, and some of that money into Novorossiya, the new regions of Russia, and some of it wherever the Russians want. But that's an exactly similar bribe scheme. Kushner and his associates, Witkoff and his sons, Trump and his sons, the entire group of Trumpies will use such a scheme, and Kirill Dmitriev endorses it as part of the future release of Russia's central bank reserves. It's identical scheme. That doesn't make Kushner brilliant. It also doesn't make him an ignorant shyster. He's a clever bribe artist. And Trump is fronting this as a scheme that is being sold, like Vance is selling it, to the Republican Party and the other critics of the MOU, as a brilliant scheme for keeping Iran's money, not in their hands, but in US hands. This is, you could say it's clever politics. It's crooked politics. It's empire politics. It's not the construction of shysters. It's the way the US negotiates. And Trump is simply making it obvious. And he's going to do it again in the Ukraine if Russia allows Witkoff and Kushner to land their plane in Moscow and drive up through the Spassky Gate into President Putin's office. That's what they're doing. And there appears to be no public resistance to this in Moscow.
So, John, you've been an advisor to governments, and let's imagine that you were an advisor to the Iranian and Russian governments at this moment, and your answer may be different with respect to each of them, but how would you advise them to deal with this reality that you have on the other side of the table people who are incorrigibly dishonest and who are bent on your destruction?
The first principle of advising governments under the gun from the United States is act unpredictably. Never act predictably. And one of the ways in which you can act unpredictably is to tell the intermediaries to go home. In this particular case, that operationally would be something that Witkoff and Kushner, used to talking on the telephone on a Yuri Steve basis with the Kremlin, that's not what they're expecting. I'm aware from sources that when Witkoff and Kushner have been in Abu Dhabi, they act privately with considerable arrogance and considerable confidence that they can push around the Emiratis, for example, or the Indians, for example, or any other party that they think they can outpoint and outshoot. So one must act unpredictably. Second, you have to look at the vulnerabilities on the US side, right? The vulnerabilities, the US is a democracy that exposes its vulnerabilities. We all do. We all live, including in Russia, in democracies that show their political vulnerability. So the next thing you do is you take a look at Vance running for re-election, running for presidency as a Roman Catholic against the Jews. He's making it very, very clear. And I've said it before here and elsewhere and written about it so that if people are offended by the terms I'm using, they can go read the evidence. They're Vance's evidence, not mine. So there's a potential gap between Vance and in doctrine, in publicity, in vote gathering, and in money for the presidential campaign between Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner. For the time being, Vance has to hide those gaps. Iran and Russia should be exploiting those gaps. Okay, what the Russian side might do unpredictably is to welcome Vice President Vance in Moscow, encourage him to use Russia as a platform for his re-election campaign, because that's what he wants, constant visibility, much more visibility than the other candidate, Marco Rubio. Rubio's the Secretary of State. One of the ways a Secretary of State runs for president is being endlessly in front of the cameras in various parts of the world. All Rubio can do now is hold Trump's papers, which is what he did in Paris, in Versailles, when they signed the MOU. He was the bag carrier, the paper carrier. He was a message boy. He was in the background. Vance is much cleverer so Moscow could welcome Vance. That would be to strike straight through the Trump plan for succession and the US politics. Also, the Russian side, instead of cultivating Trump and his family, which is what Dimitri is focusing on, they've got to cultivate all the other elements of the Republican Party that will go into the campaign, for presidency, which will warm up immediately after Election Day in November. Look, we can go into it. I don't get paid to do this stuff anymore. I'm basically banned from all the countries where I once was a government advisor. And in one of them, they tried to kill me. So look, you could say my advice has run out of time and run out of credibility. But if I could say something in terms of two principles here, when you're small and under the US gun, you don't hold up your hands. That's what they think you'll do. You act very unpredictably. And we could go into the stories of how that works. But I'm not going to reveal secrets about how to do that now. Second, you exploit the US presidential cycle, the politics of the White House, and you look at a very unusual race that Vance is trying to run now, and you blow out the differences and you exploit them. At the moment, however, there's no doubt the Russian side is heavily invested. It spends more than $1 billion a year on its propaganda systems, especially Simonyan's RT. They don't understand this. They are totally committed to spending their money appeasing the Trump machine, the Trump family. They are incapable of doing either anything unpredictably or anything to split the US politics. What are they capable of? Spending money on useless interventions with useless elements that have no political value at all in the United States. And that's what the FBI has been busy prosecuting for years. Pathetic wastes of money. Most of the money which came out of the state budget stayed in Moscow's pockets. This simply reveals that the Russian propaganda system, the Russian political operational system, is incompetent in the United States. Now, how can that be after so many years of not learning? It's extraordinary.
Yeah, I will just add one other observation, John, to your excellent advice, and that is a poll just came out done by CBS News, which showed that 78% of Americans want the war on Iran to end. 78%. And it also found that 69% don't believe that Iran's nuclear program ended, which means that a large majority of those who want the war to end want it to end even though they don't believe that Iran's nuclear program is ended. So it seems to me that this is the time. I mean, I'm going to use a crude phrase, but I think it really sort of highlights it. When you got them by the balls, you squeeze. I mean, that seems to be the appropriate approach here. Trump would be committing political suicide, as would the Republicans, if they relaunched the hot war between now and the midterms. And this is not the time to be taking pressure off of them by opening up the Strait of Hormuz. That's just my,
Yes. Well, I can only reinforce that. Your ball squeezing operational advice here. There are some other polls, and these go in parallel. On the one hand, you're quite right, Dimitri. The polls clearly show roughly 2/3 of American people do not want war in Iran. However, if you ask, and this is also being measured every week, every month, and certainly by the White House, what are the main issues that American voters see as important in the upcoming midterm elections and then the presidential elections, and how do they assemble their approval of the president and the vice president and so forth. The Iran war, the killing in Gaza, genocide in Gaza, the Iran war, and the war in Europe don't count. May I repeat that? American voters count about what the cost into their pocket is of the gas they just put in their auto tank. This is normal. What's
Yeah,
the most?
but because the resumption of the war would increase the cost of their gas, I would assume that this is an issue that would matter a great deal to them.
Yes, exactly. So we go exactly to, and I'm reinforcing your point, the Iranian strategy must be to control the Strait of Hormuz and continuously show that at the Strait, Iranian policy can affect the cost of the gas tank in the US and the cost of military expenditure, which is coming out, most Americans think, out of their health care, their hospital care, their education care, their welfare expenses. They don't want spending on that stuff because they're afraid that they are losing health care. And this is at the very top. The fear that the US budget is being blown out by war expense and the cost will be to American individuals' medical care and survival, that's obviously a voter concern. It's a priority. So you would say, and I agree with you, Dimitri, if you're advising the Iranians here, don't let your whatever's gripping the Hormuz Strait, you don't loosen it. You demonstrate unpredictable action and you maintain US voter sensitivity. And the link between the Hormuz Strait and the IRGC control and US voters couldn't be more obvious now. So therefore, they must use the MOU, and we could argue back and forth about the nature of the trading and deal making that went into the provisions. But if they're all in violation by the US and by the Israelis, the Iranian side has the opportunity to demonstrate, but not to the Israelis. That the US voters don't care about them either. The important message the Iran can deliver from the Persian Gulf is to US voters. And they aren't delivering that right now. Trump's delivering it. Vance is delivering it. You look at the emphasis in all their public statements, they say, we're making gas cheaper. Look at the price of oil today, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Iran has a counter to that. They're not using it.
Well, John, that was a rather distressing conversation, but very enlightening one as always. Thank you so much for coming back on our program, and we look forward to the next conversation.
Next conversation, Dimitri. Yes.
Thanks. Signing off. Thank you. We'll be back with you later tomorrow with a report on this disgraceful World Cup. Signing off for today, June 25th, 2026.